Well, we're back again to share the love. And I was walking over here, and I have to apologize because this is a very male-dominant lecture today. I know. Welcome to Western civilization. I realize, though, I don't have there's lots of authors and, thinkers, and they're all men. So next time, I was walking over here like, this is terrible. So next time I'll change the gender dynamic a bit, okay? I promise to do that. Although it may be interesting to sort of see how the gender stuff plays out through what we talk about today, because clearly this is a gendered topic. So we'll see how it goes. Let's see. Craig, there we go. So the plan, where we've been so far, and I'll do a quick review of what we did last time. It may not be that quick, but we'll talk about how, approaches to studying love. And then today we'll spend some time talking about puzzles that come out of love. I've got 10 puzzles, and we'll kind of bounce through those fairly quickly. But when you start thinking about this stuff, it's very complicated and very tricky. And then after the break, we'll talk about family and friendship and altruism, and then we'll conclude with the religious stuff. And, you're going to all see your families over Thanksgiving probably. And isn't that a weird, it preluded for December 2nd, but we love these people, but we don't often like them too much. If you think how this works at the holidays. I'm about to go to visit my parents who live in Arizona, and I think there's going to be like 30 some odd people there, including some of these relatives who've just recently moved, who I haven't seen in like 25 years. Isn't that interesting, and you still feel connected with people even though you haven't seen them in that long? Anyway, that's one of the puzzles, is why do we feel these kind of connections with our loved ones when we don't often see them or interact with them. But you see them suddenly after a decade, and you look in their eyes, you're like, okay, there's a kind of connection there. It's kind of cool. Heading towards Thanksgiving, I thought maybe we'd start with this idea, just to kind of briefly think about Thanksgiving and thankfulness and gratitude and how that's connected to love. So if you think this through, there's this idea about being grateful, just sort of cosmic gratitude, just to be grateful to be alive. And so, there's something there. And it's connected to a loving attitude, I would argue. There's a kind of openness, receptivity to the world. So there's a bunch of places we could start to think about this. But here is Spinoza. Have you run into Spinoza before? Oh, good. Did it hurt when you ran? No, I'm kidding. He, very interesting figure who writes this big book about ethics, and it's not really about ethics. It's more about metaphysics and religion and everything tied together. But there's some segments in the book where he kind of deals with concrete virtues or attitudes or dispositions or behaviors, and one of them is gratitude. So he explains gratitude like this. Says he puts it under the category of reciprocal love. This reciprocal love, and consequently to the desire of benefiting him who loves us and who endeavors to benefit us, is called gratitude or thankfulness. So gratitude is the idea that we want to give thanks to the person who has expressed love for us. We're already in this loving relationship. And you could actually argue that gratitude helps to cement and build and sustain those loving relationships. And there's some data about this that shows, relationships go better if you just say thank you. And if you've been married for a long time, sometimes you forget. I've been having that encounter with my wife recently. But, just a little bit of please and thank you actually can go a long way to revive and reorient ourselves in these loving relationships. He continues, he says, he who has conferred a benefit on anyone from motives of love or honor will feel pain if he sees that the benefit is received without gratitude. You give your time. So who brought me that thing about sharing your time just now? Yeah, this idea of generosity and sharing your time. You spend time with someone and they just kind of turn the cold shoulder and don't reciprocate in any way. Now, there's a kind of benevolent love where you just give yourself without hope of anything in return. but that's kind of a angelic, saintly look. Most of us need a little feedback from now and again. So we expect that there's going to be some kind of gratitude, right? And love relationships hinge upon this back and forth, this to and fro. He then gives this definition: thankfulness or gratitude is the desire or zeal springing from love, whereby we endeavor to benefit him who, with similar feelings of love, has conferred a benefit to us. This back and forth, I'm going to use this word several times today, a dialectic. Have you ever run into this word before, dialectic? It means a back and forth, a to and fro, a give and a take. So we'll talk about that. But in light of Thanksgiving, you'll start with gratitude. I'll try to end with gratitude too, to kind of wrap this with a Thanksgiving ribbon. And there's one source for that. So last time we talked about different types of love, and I think we concluded with the discussion of poetry and art and romantic love. We'll move forward from that today. Among the things we talked about were some history and religion. We looked at that world's oldest love poem and so on. We talked about the biological aspect of love and the hormones that flow and why it feels so good to be in love. Today it'll get darker. And we'll have to maybe doubt today whether we can actually be in love by the time we talk about Dr. Freud and some of the other stuff. So that's the plan today, is to deal with that kind of stuff, the Freudian tradition, which, if you know anything about Freud, it's not going to be pleasant. And then we'll talk about 20th century existentialism, which really develops out of that. And you could even argue that Freud is there in the existentialist milieu. And then we'll conclude with these puzzles about love today. Okay? So here's the dialectic. I used that word earlier. Again, dialectic means a to and fro, a back and forth, the interconnectedness of things. To put this even differently, it means that one thing is defined in terms of the other thing. This is dialectical definitions of things. We understand the world, ourselves, and objects in the world in their connections and their differences from other things. It sounds deep and profound, but it's kind of common sense. You know, if you can't figure out what the definition is of something, you can define it in terms of its opposite, what it is not, right? This idea about dialectics goes back to Plato and the Greeks, so they use the word. But in the modern era, there's this philosopher, Hegel. I wrote my dissertation on Hegel. Long and boring dissertation that no one would ever want to read, including myself. Hegel talks, he's the famous guy known for dialectics. If you want to put Hegel in context, Karl Marx is sort of aficionado of Hegel. So when Marx develops his story about history progressing towards communism, he's picking all of this stuff up from Hegel. Okay, Hegel's an important person in the 19th century. Hegel's story about what it is to be us, what it is to be a human being, says that we are always in relation to other human beings. And what we want from other human beings is to be recognized as human. We're not objects, we're not tools, we're not pencils, we're not mountains, we are human beings. Now here's the interesting puzzle. Each of us wants the other person to recognize us in our humanity. But from the one-sided perspective, all I really want from you is your recognition of me. I don't really want to give you the kind of recognition you want from me. So Hegel says that this devolves or explodes, develops into what he calls the master-slave dialectic. So this runs all through this tradition, especially the 20th century existentialists who read their Hegel. Master-slave dialectic is something like this. The self and the other encounter each other on a desert island or wherever, and the self says to the other, you should recognize me. Of course, from the other perspective, the self says to that other, no, you should recognize me. What do you think is going to happen in this male-dominant worldview? Fight to the death. Okay? I mean, Hegel's talking about the roots of violence, and this is war, and this is culture, and history bursts out of that, right? If you think about the history of humanity, it's the history of struggles for recognition of various persons and nationalities and so on, okay? Here's the problem, though. Self confronts other. You must recognize me. Other says no. Self beats the other into a pulp and kills the other. Ooh. Is there any recognition? No. There's nobody, thank you, you got it. There's nobody left to recognize you. This creates a big problem because we demand recognition from the other, but the other, if the other doesn't give it to us, we kill the other, which then destroys the very thing we wanted in the first place. Okay? So it's an unhappy solution. The solution, then, Hegel says, often is a kind of submission. Struggle unto death becomes master-slave relation. Right? So now it's about power and it's about one recognizing the other. Okay? So the slave submits and recognizes the master. Problem. Did the master want to be recognized by a slave? No. A worthless, pathetic slave who would submit to me? Bleh. Could care less. Right? So struggle unto death, if it's death, unsatisfactory. If it's slavery, unsatisfactory because you're not getting recognized by the kind of being you wanted to be recognized by. Solution, says Hegel, is mutual recognition. Somehow from master-slave, we've got to develop into friendship. Right? He doesn't use the word much, but I would argue that this fits with love relationships. And we'll see this in the 20th century. The 20th century existentialists talk a lot about this, how these struggles should, when they work themselves out properly, should culminate in love. It's not about destroying the other person or forcing the other person to submit to you. Instead, it's about finding yourself recognized by the other person and recognizing the other person as they want to be recognized. Does that make sense? So that's where we're going to try to end up with this. And the source for a lot of this stuff in the 20th century is Hegel. We talked about this a little bit last time. I think I had this slide here, how our ideas are mediated through, how our loving relationships are mediated through ideas. It's a Hegel model, frankly, because this connection between the self and other comes by way of our ideas about one another, right? When let me get to my next slide. When I encounter the other person, is this right? When I encounter the other person, I can't encounter them in their full personality. Instead, I encounter my idea of the other person. There's always a problem, right? You look into her eyes, and you're thinking it's time for love, and she's thinking, I got to pay a bill, or, can you get on with business? We're always involved in projections and mediation. That's the master-slave problem, just explained in a different way, right? Between the self and the other is always this problem of miscommunication, misunderstanding, projection and rejection from one to the other. It's a tough problem. Any questions about that kind of framework that we're going to be working with today?
I think I'm in the wrong place.
We can make it more concrete. If you have anyone want to share an example, we could do it with example. So let's move forward past Hegel to Nietzsche and Freud. By the way, there's more to psychology than just this. This is just my stuff I like. So the kind of dark and sinister psychology that happens in the late part of the 19th century towards the early part of the 20th century. And by the way, there are people in this tradition who are not nearly as dark and sinister as Nietzsche and Freud. We'll talk about at least one of those, Erich Fromm, who is a humanist, existentialist, psychoanalyst who offers quite a nice response to Freud and Nietzsche. But we got to get Nietzsche and Freud on the table here. So I got this off the internet, I didn't create this, but the two kind of ways to conceive these two thinkers. Nietzsche, very famous for saying God is dead. Actually, the rest of the sentence goes, God is dead and we have killed him because we don't believe in him. It's our fault, not God's fault. And then, of course, Freud deconstructs and disassembles basically all of Western civilization, reducing it to the Oedipus complex, this is the God is dad thing, reducing it to libido and sexual energy and egoism and narcissism and the function of illusions. We'll get there in a second, okay? So Nietzsche, I'm not going to read all these quotes, so I'll just put them up there. I'll explain what Nietzsche is talking about. Master-slave in the background, right? When we encounter one another, we claim all this stuff about love and friendship and generosity and benevolence. But what we really want, deep down inside in our male-dominant worldview, what we really want is power. We want the self to be affirmed. It's about us, not about them. Okay? So Nietzsche reduces all loving relationships back to a kind of egoism. It's about me, not the other person. You hear that master-slave in the background, right? Do you follow me on this so far? The master wants the slave to recognize him, and it probably is a him, and it doesn't always work out because the self doesn't quite get what it wants from this kind of process. The name of the book where Nietzsche articulates some of this is The Gay Science, and it's not what you think. The name, it's actually The Joyful Wisdom is another way you can translate this. Now Nietzsche thinks this is all good news. Great good news. It's all egoism, people. There is no love. That's all make-believe. Nietzsche then suggests we're free. We've been liberated from all of that nonsense that tries to tell us that we shouldn't be egoistic. In fact, Nietzsche suggests we just are. When we talk about love, we're really just talking about ourselves. This idea of possessiveness, he says, love of the sexes betrays itself most plainly as the striving after possession. The lover wants the unconditioned sole possession of the person longed for by him. You hear master-slave there, right? You want to own the other person. Or to kind of get a little more theoretical about this, you want your idea to be an obsession in the mind of the person, of the other person, right? Kind of an adolescent fantasy, right? You want to be the entire world for the person that you want to love you. He connects it, he says, this ferocious lust of property. That's what sexual love is. It's the desire to absolutely possess the other person. Completely narcissistic, completely egoistic. Is he right? You're nodding.
I'm just nodding that I hear you right.
What do you think? Is this the right track to go to think about love?
No.
No? It's too dark. It's too true.
It might be with real beginning love, that, that's all-encompassing love that doesn't last.
Well, okay. This, she says, this is like adolescent love. It's beginning love, but it doesn't last. Why can't it last?
Well, it's crazy.
It's crazy. Egoism and narcissism. Note back to the master-slave problem. Why this can't last is it's going to create power differentials. You're either going to destroy the other person or turn them into your slave, and then you're not going to get what you wanted. Right? The person you want to possess is a full person, not a slave, right? Not a quaking mass of goo. You wanted a real individual to love you. To love you, right? When you, according to this approach, and Freud has this too, when you love the other person, you also want the other person to love you, right? In these conditions, it's impossible to get the other person to love you. All you have is submission and power. This idea about possession and property, back to the male dominance problem, you know this. For most of human history, the love object, if she was female, really just was property. Right? Really just was possession. And you know how it works. The father who owns the daughter hands her off to the husband who takes possession of her. It's like selling a car. You sign over the pink slip, It's not surprising that Nietzsche thinks in this way, because that's our tradition. It's the male-dominant tradition. Yeah.
It also seems to me that it's the type of feeling that a child has. When they're very young, they're totally dependent and they want that object that's taking care of them, that feeds them and holds them and loves them, that they're totally dependent on. That's their love. I would think that's the beginning of that feeling of what that gets interpreted as love. Oh, that's how I feel loved. That's what it's like to be loved and be taken care of, and it just
Yeah.
seems like
Do you hear?
some
Can
sort
you
of-
hear what she says?
seems like some
That
sort of
the child. I mean, she's channeling Dr. Freud here. Do you hear that? I mean, you must have read your Freud.
To me, it just makes sense in child development.
Yeah. So the child depends entirely on its mother.
Right.
It needs its mother to take care of
To
all of its
survive.
needs,
To survive.
And it experiences that as a kind of love, however that you want to question whether that's really love, but it experienced that as a satisfaction. Its needs are satisfied by this other that it wants to possess, control, because that's how the child controls its own world. That's how it survives in the world. Okay. Herr Freud, you just came, thank you. You
made your segue.
You made my segue for me. Freud explains this whole story in a lot of long-winded writings. If you've ever had a chance to read Freud, I once took an entire semester course on Freud, and we tried almost everything that he wrote, and I was so overwhelmed with information that I had an anxiety attack and needed to talk to my psychiatrist. I'm kidding. I mean, the guy could write a lot. And by the way, a lot of this has been somewhat discredited, right? I mean, the evidence that he provides and so on, those of you who have studied psychology know that we've moved beyond this. But the cultural motifs, and what's really interesting about Freud and Nietzsche and the kind of humanist approach to this stuff, is they really are not talking so much about like what's going on in the brain, but about how we understand ourselves in terms of our themes and myths and the ideas in culture. I find it useful from that regard, okay? So Freud is going to claim that love is an illusion. Love is an illusion. What he means by illusion is that it satisfies a wish. So in this provocative text, I don't know if you've had a chance to read The Future of an Illusion. It's fairly short and easy to read, I think, if you're interested. He says that that God and religion are also illusions. They satisfy our wish. It provides a wish fulfillment. Is it true? No. Does it make us feel good? Yes. That's all you need from a psychological standpoint, from Freud's psychological standpoint. It satisfies your needs. Religion does that, but love also has that function. I mean, I'm talking now the idea of love, right? Our idea about how love works and functions. It should satisfy our needs and all that romantic poetry stuff. That's an illusion, right? If you've lived long enough and had a loving relationship, you know it's not all flowers and poetry. The poets were wrong about that. And yet, those illusions function in our thinking about things, function in our culture, and can be satisfying. Different way of putting this. It's possible to be in love. Hooray! It's possible to be in love with love, right? We like those illusions. They're fun, and they satisfy us. Here's one way that he puts this. He tells us, and there's something to this. What we really want is, deep Freud, we want the mother's breast or something, What we really want is the sexual gratification that comes with this whole thing. So we project ourselves into the other person, and we pretend that other person satisfies every single thing we're looking for. Hooray, I found her! She's perfect in every way. And then you write a poem and send it to her on Valentine's Day. Is it true that she's perfect in every way? Of course not. But when you're in love, maybe young puppy love or adolescent love, at that stage, you project all of your wishes and dreams into the other person. Right? Isn't it wonderful? Young lovers in the world. I feel like Frank Sinatra should sing, young lovers. Problem, of course, is that as time goes on, we realize that the loved object is not who we thought she was, or vice versa, who we thought he was. right? This overestimation, this illusion can cause all kinds of malfunctions and problems, right? Back to the diagram where the idea gets in between us, right? If I'm thinking about you in terms of my idea of you, I don't have you, you know? And I get caught up and hung up on the idea, and I can't get to the object. Can't have a genuine relationship in that way. Why do we do this? It's sex, right? He talks about the sensual charm. He's talking about lust, sexual desire, right? That, for Freud, that fuels all of this. Now, with some sympathy to Freud to try to give him some credibility, he's not just talking about like male orgasm or something. When he's using words like sensual charm and sexuality and libido and all this stuff, it's about pleasure. It's not just about genitalia. Although if you know his story, you know, it goes through these phases from the anal to the genital and so on and so forth. But he has a kind of robust idea about what we want in the world. It is traced out in our bodies. It's connected to bodily pleasure, but it's not just that one version of sexuality. Anyway, notice what he's saying here. Why do we project ourselves into that loved object? Because for that object to be worthy of my desire, it has to be perfect. You get it? I mean, my desire is special. You know, I'm a special person in the world. I would only ever fall in love with someone who's as special as I deserve. Isn't that an interesting little twist on this?
Back to Nietzsche.
Back to Nietzsche. It's ego. I mean, we inflate our own egos. Notice this. You write a love poem. I mean, you ever think about this? Did you ever write love poetry? I did. It's embarrassing. You know, I was 19. I won't tell you the whole story, but you know, you write this stuff, and then your wife comes to you 20 years later and says, check this out. You know, how embarrassing that is. You're nodding. Never look at your high school yearbooks with your spouse, by the way. That's a bad idea. Now I lost my train of thought with this. About the problem of projection and idealization, right? How this works is we flatter ourselves by writing the poetry to the one we love. It's not about them, it's about us. So the more I can build up her charms and make her beautiful, the better I look. You get that? It's a nice, interesting, subtle move, right? You praise the hell out of it, and then suddenly say, wow, and she loves me too. Yay, I must be perfect. You know? Sort of like what real estate agents do when they're selling houses, right? You just kind of you fluff it up and make it look like it's a place you'd actually want to live. So this is Freud. Let's just read this part in bold. He says, we love it, the object, on account of the perfections which we have striven to reach for our own ego, and which we should now like to procure in this roundabout way as a means of satisfying our own narcissism. We love ourselves so much, we create an object that's worthy of our love, then we love it, and we say that that thing loves us. Yay! All good at that point. Isn't that how it works? Okay, I mean, there's a lot more to say about Freud. We could pause for a minute if you have any thoughts or comments or questions about Freud. Yes?
Well, I can relate to the idea of the teenage, the early 20s, wanting a partner or calling a partner that you have your lover and seeking perfection in that. But I would suggest that, you know, as you get older and you get smarter, that love comes and begins and grows from the time when you accept the fact that your partner is not perfect. And you find that there are things about your partner that in that imperfection, you love them even more because you understand them and you accept them. And that's a lot different than what Freud was talking about.
It sure sounds different. Yeah. And by the way, you make me think that's on the self side too, when you suddenly realize you're not perfect, right? And can you learn to love yourself even with all of your own imperfections, you know? That maybe And Freud never goes there, but maybe maturity in this process has to do with accepting finitude and failure, right? And still sticking with yourself and the other person, right? I'm not sure Freud ever ends up in that space. And that, by the way, again, back where we started, this may be a problem with male domination in this, right? The patriarchal view, the worldview that Freud is coming from, it is about possession, and it still is a kind of narcissistic, caught up in your own self-image approach to things. Maybe a feminist view would have an alternative approach to this that would talk about loving relations as mutual giving and care and nurturing and so on. That ain't Freud, though. Anything else about Freud? I mean, we didn't talk about Oedipus and all the rest of it. You want to talk about Oedipus? Yeah. It's icky. It's embarrassing. So let me shift gears, then we're going to move to existentialism. Erich Fromm, I mean, there's several, someone mentioned Viktor Frankl to me before. I mean, there's a lot of different ways we could go with this. The 20th century is kind of, it explodes with people talking about love and sex. You could maybe say that this is something to do with, I don't know, liberatory movements where now, instead of having to channel all this inquiry, the philosophy of love, instead of having to channel it through the church, suddenly we're free to think about this stuff. That's one way of interpreting this. Anyway, Erich Fromm is one of these people who's more or less the generation after Freud who's responding to this wrinkle in psychology. This interesting book, The Art of Loving, he basically says, it's actually a Freudian insight, but that love is the meaning of life, right? That what we're looking for along the way is love and to be loved, right? The way to get there is to be loving. Surprise. That's totally different from the Nietzsche-Freud approach. The Nietzsche-Freud approach says the way to get there is to beat the other thing into submission, to take possession of it and force it to love you. That's Nietzsche. Freud, the way to get there is to puff the other thing up with a bunch of illusions and poetry and nonsense and then pretend that that's love, right? Now Fromm's got a slightly different approach to this, where he is going to say that the way to get the love you want is to become loving, lovable, so that the lover would want to love you in return. It's a nice humanistic switch. There's a lot more we could say about that, but we're going to switch to existentialism because I would put Fromm in that category with the existentialists. And we can come back to this. Did I talk about existentialism with you all in one of these courses before? Okay. Love them, the existentialists. They're so cool. They wear berets and smoke cigarettes and hang out in Paris, you know. These are, it's a caricature. This is a caricature of three of the important existentialists. Can you name them? Sartre is in the middle. Simone de Beauvoir over here, and Camus. As Alex Trebek likes to say on Jeopardy, Camus. He pronounced, have you ever noticed Alex Trebek? He has this really beautiful French accent. It's because he's Canadian. The Canadians are allowed to pronounce French. Americans aren't. I mean, we could talk a lot until we're blue in the face about these characters, but one interesting bit here is that de Beauvoir and Sartre had a relationship, right? And one of the stories I've heard, I've not really dug into all of this, is that Simone de Beauvoir had all the good ideas, and Sartre borrowed them from her. So the male dominance comes back again. We'll talk a bit about Sartre. And so I guess I did have one female in my lecture. I should have gone to her instead of Sartre and the others, but oh well. So what happens in the 20th century then? Once we make our way through Nietzsche and Freud and all the rest of it, the middle of the 20th century, what happens is an affirmation, an acknowledgement of the fact that the old stories don't work so well. So when Freud says that all this stuff is an illusion and explains it away, now we're left with a universe where we have to make sense of things for ourselves. Okay? This happens in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, middle part of the 20th century. You throw in some genocide and some atomic weaponry in there, and things get pretty serious pretty quickly. You know, are human beings mature enough and responsible enough to live on this planet by ourselves? Not clear what the answer to that is still. The existentialists, basically the problem for the 20th century existentialists is to try to find a way to make a meaningful life in this world once all the old gods have faded away. So remember Nietzsche with God is dead, right? Now, you could, by the way, and I'll show you in a moment, you can be a Christian existentialist. There are several. Gabriel Marcel is one of my favorites. We'll talk about Monnier here in a minute. Christian existentialism, 20th century problem, if you're trying to kind of, how would this fit with my own worldview if you happen to be Christian? The idea is it's just no longer possible to take seriously the story that is told in Sunday school, right? Somehow, and we even heard Pope Francis suggest something like this recently, right? Somehow the natural sciences have to be incorporated. Somehow we have to recognize all of the critical Bible studies. Somehow we have to make sense of less literal interpretation of the scriptures, right? Now you can still go with Christianity from that story, but you have to figure out how to make meaning out of Christianity once we've moved our way through Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and all the rest of it, once we've seen the Holocausts and so on. Here's one way that this existential problem is described from Fromm. Man is the only animal for whom his own existence is a problem, which he has to solve, and from which he cannot escape. Dark. Or beautifully liberating, right? This is us. You know, life is, we live it. Every day we got to figure out how to give it meaning and make sense of it, right? Now Fromm's suggestion is that it has something to do with love. And actually many of the existentialists point in that direction, which is why they're very interesting in this philosophy of love discussion. He says this: one is not loved accidentally. One's own power to love produces love. Here, the dialectic, right? The more you can love, the more you will be loved, which you probably discovered in this life by now, right? To get what you want, you have to give it away. You know, the more you give it, the more it will come back to you. Just as being interested makes one interesting. People are concerned with the question of whether they are attractive, while they forget that the essence of attractiveness is their own capacity to love. You know this. The people that you love the best are those who actually express love to you because you see their lovability in the fact that they're so loving. That's Fromm. Stop me at any time. Sartre now. The notorious and weird Jean-Paul Sartre. I mean, there's a whole lot we could say about him. But deep in the heart of this impossible book to read. Anyone tried to read this book? Being in Nothingness? You tried it? Oh, God, you want to throw it against the wall. It starts off bad and gets worse. I mean, it's... and he, by the way, I mean, just like a total tangent. Sartre is an improvement over some of the German existentialists. This guy Heidegger, if you've ever heard of Heidegger, I mean, from obscurity to darkness. That's about... Anyway, I mean, we can make sense of it, but... Anyway, moving forward. In the heart of this book, Being in Nothingness, Sartre is trying to describe what it is to be a human being. And, I mean, there's a lot of complications here, but one of the issues about being a human being is that we confront other human beings and we want them to recognize us as human beings. Hear the master-slave thing coming back again? What we really want, and this is basically Sartre just explaining Hegel, what we want is the other person to freely give themselves to us. We want the other person's humanity to be ours. Now you can hear there's a paradox here already, right? To say that we want the other person's freedom to be ours implies that it's not free anymore, right? You know this, if you love something, set it free. You know, if it comes, that's basically what he's saying more or less. We want the other person to be a fully embodied person who recognizes our humanity and loves us for who we are. And notice what he says here, we don't want to possess an automaton. We want the lover to be a fully embodied human being. Back to the male dominance problem, right? Think of the tradition of how love relationships were structured for thousands of years in Western civilization. Was it possible for men to love women when women are not fully free? I'm not sure about that. Right? Sartre says we don't want to possess an automaton. We don't want to be loved by property. We don't want to be loved by a slave. We want to be loved by another human being. You can use, by the way, people have used this stuff to move in the direction of feminism. Here's Sartre explaining master-slave again. The total enslavement of the beloved kills the love of the lover. If the beloved is transformed into an automaton, the lover finds himself alone. Thus, the lover does not desire to possess the beloved as one possesses a thing. He demands a special type of appropriation. He wants to possess freedom as freedom. It's not so surprising, is it? If you've had loving relationships that work, that has to be part of it, right? Where each person is free to be their own free self. When it's not there, when that freedom is not there, it's not really love in its highest sense. Instead, it becomes master-slave, it becomes possessive, it becomes domineering, and so on. He continues, maybe this will be the last thing with Sartre. He says, in love, the lover wants to be the whole world for the beloved. He wants to be the object in which the other's freedom consents to lose itself, the object in which the other consents to find his being and his raison d'être. Now, if you think about this is really weird. What Sartre is saying is when love works, we are like God for the other person, right? We want to be embodied in their consciousness somehow, so that they are so obsessed with us that their entire experience circulates around us. We want to be the absolute for the other. But, of course, if this is going to work, you are also going to have to be, it's going to have to go reciprocally, right? Where you find yourself circling around the other as well, so that she is now the absolute for you. Get the solution for the existentialist? The meaning of life for the existentialist is to find this kind of profound love. I mean, God is now out of the picture, right? All that's left is for two human beings to find themselves together somehow to make sense of their own existence together. Does it ever work? Never. This is the problem. I mean, it's a big problem, right? So if you set it up this way, that love is supposed to be so pure and so absolute, can it ever happen? I mean, think about the recipe here for jealousy and envy and manipulation and all the dark and sinister stuff that comes along with love. If you read some of the existentialist literature and novels and plays and so on, you see that really, while this may be the ideal that we have, it leads to all kinds of social dysfunction. Any questions about Sartre? Okay, so here's one of the Christian existentialists, Emmanuel Mounier. 1590, wow, he lived in reverse. Why this guy is interesting is he is one of the main thinkers in what's called personalism. Now, brief history lesson. Existentialism becomes personalism, which goes on to have a direct influence on Martin Luther King Jr. and had a direct influence on Pope John Paul II, who studied personalism when he was a philosophy student. This personalist, this Christian existentialist personalism, has this profound impact in the 20th century. I mean, think about how important both of those characters are, Martin Luther King and Pope John Paul II, right? This idea about the importance of love that Mounier derives from the existentialists, rereading Sartre, rereading Freud, rereading Nietzsche, rereading Hegel. You didn't know you were getting this boring 20th century philosophy lesson. Anyway, Mounier is basically saying something very similar to Sartre, but it's less domineering. It's less wanting to be the God for the other person than being willing to give yourself to the other person in that way. It's more on the side of the loving than on the side of the one who wants to be loved. Put this differently, it's less narcissistic and more oriented towards the other person. So, this concept, personalism, one way that this is described is that Sartre, Freud, Nietzsche, all of these people we've been talking about are egoistical individualists. Egoistical individualists. They view love from the standpoint of me, the male, right? The personalists shift gears. Instead of viewing it from the perspective of the one who wants to be loved, they view it from the perspective of the concrete other person. Different way of putting this. There's another author, Emmanuel Levinas, who's in this same ballpark. He's a Jewish scholar, Jewish existentialist. Levinas says we have to find ourselves confronted by the face-to-face encounter with another person. That's the source of all experience, is when the other person presents themselves to us and we see their infinite absolute value, their dignity and inherent worth. That's personalism. Can you hear how Martin Luther King could develop out of that? Can you hear how John Paul II's idea of a consistent ethic of life and all the rest of that can develop from this idea? One way that Mounier explains this, and Levinas puts it this way also, is what happens in love is the lover, the individual, is decentered. You're knocked off your heels, right? You no longer revolve in your own narcissistic, egoistic orbit. Suddenly you find yourself orbiting around something other than yourself, right? The decentering or the decentralization. We suddenly see the world from someone else's perspective. Maybe there's some kind of developmental project here, right? That somehow, the infant sees itself only, itself, projects itself somehow in the other, but ultimately how this is supposed to end up is you find yourself orbiting around another center. That's love from this perspective. And then he says this. This is a beautiful retort to Descartes. If you remember your Descartes, who says, I think, therefore I am. He says, to be is to love, right? I am because I love. I become myself because I love. Conclude with Mounier. I love, this is the new cogito is Descartes, I think, therefore I am. The new argument is, I love, therefore I am. Whoa! Beautiful. Here's the problem, just in case you don't get how profound this is. Little old Descartes. You heard of Descartes before? Yeah, I think, therefore I am. Okay. I think, therefore I am. Descartes argues himself into a corner where he's stuck and it's just him and he's wondering whether he actually exists. Right? He doubts everything. He's in his dark room and he wonders, do I actually exist? And he says, I must exist because I'm a thinking thing. I'm asking myself, Descartes says, I'm wondering whether I exist, therefore I must exist. Yay! Modern philosophy explodes out of that. You go 400 years later, Mounier changes the story. I love, therefore I am. I feel myself infected by. I feel myself pulled towards the gravity of the other person. I experience other persons in the world with value and dignity. Now I know that I exist because she exists. Now I know that I exist because, let's make this theological, because I can feel God's love. Right? It's not about thinking. Notice how this is a radical shift. Not about thinking. It's about the experience of value in the other person. Or, again, theologically, in the presence of God as a person. In the presence of God as a person. Or in the presence of God in the person of the other. Right? I mean, this is how this gets traced out in Catholic personalism. Yeah.
If you love somebody and you're just possessed with thinking about them and feeling about them all the time, how do you know that's not an illusion for loving yourself within the other?
Freud is in the background.
Yeah, Freud's in the foreground.
Yeah, Freud never left the building. Yeah. I love.
And he never will.
And he never. I love, therefore I am. What does Freud say about this? Yeah, because you love yourself so much. You know, you think you're circling around this beloved object, or you're, as I said, the presence of God in the person you love. You know, Freud. You hear Freud? He's laughing. Ha ha! These illusions that we sell ourselves. We want to think that God loves us, because that makes us worthy, right? If God didn't love us, where would we be? Narcissism, from Freud's perspective. This is a dialectic that goes back and forth. Yeah.
Well, couldn't it also just be a mystical or spiritual belief that I know I'm an expression of God and I see God in that person, we're all one, you know, namaste, you know, whatever.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't have to be egoistic. Couldn't it be a spiritual
Yes, no, so
expression of God?
yeah, this personalist, this strain of existentialism, 20th century mysticism, or however you want to put it, yeah, it's the presence of the mystery. In Gabriel Marcel, if you don't know Gabriel Marcel, you love to read Gabriel Marcel, the Christian existentialist, who has a book called The Mystery of Being. And the mystery is the presence of the divine in me and in the other person and in the world. Right? And it's mediated through love because the mystery is felt or experienced as love. And Herr Freud says, cut it out. You're lying to yourself. That's an illusion. You want to feel good about yourself, so you call it love, and you claim the universe loves you. Ha! Not true. It's illusory. Yes.
If you don't believe in God, you can't adopt that way of thinking or feeling.
Except, so here's maybe one possibility, like the atheist personalist. Now we're mixing our isms and ists, but the atheist personalist might argue that the only thing of value is this experience of loving and being loved. If we can't get there, says the atheist personalist, then we're stuck with Descartes in the closet. You know, then we're stuck with Mr. Freud in the crib. You know, we can't move out of narcissism. We can't move out of egoism. The only hope is for love. To be loved and to be loving and to give love and to feel love. Otherwise, we're left in the closet. I don't know if that satisfies you. Yeah.
Is that not an end in itself? Because most of the existentialists I've ever read or heard of are not Christian existentialists, but rather agnostic or atheists, who form, I think, the basis of humanism, who bring us to that point where God is not necessary in a loving relationship. Am I on?
I think you're on track. Yeah, you're right. Of course, there are Christian existentialists. So, you don't want the whole long history lesson, but Kierkegaard, I don't know if you've heard of Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian, he's known as an existentialist, and he writes a wonderful series of books on love. And from his perspective, it's connected with this. From his perspective, in order to understand God's love, you have to go through concrete human love. Right? You work your way beyond it, but it's concrete human love that gives us a hint of divine love. Now, the atheist, agnostic existentialists say, enough. We go through human love. Where are we going? But we know that works to provide meaning and satisfaction in life. Camus, back to Albert Camus, to quote Alex Trebek. Camus, he writes this famous, beautiful book called The Myth of Sisyphus. It's Sisyphus who has to push his boulder up a hill. Yeah.
Would you repeat that?
The name of the book?
Yeah.
Yeah, The Myth of Sisyphus. I'll say it really fast and it'll sound silly. No, Sisyphus, spelled Sisyphus. Sisyphus. It's a Greek story. The story of Sisyphus is that Sisyphus is condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a hill every day, and at night the boulder rolls down and he has to push the boulder again for eternity. Okay. The atheist, agnostic, existentialist, that may be it. There ain't no way out, right? There's no afterlife, there's no hope, right? But Camus says, a hint, right, that if we're going to find a meaningful life while pushing our boulder, we have to learn to love our rock. You have to find some love in the journey, right, no matter what it is. And in the book, he explains a variety of ways to make sense of the world, and one of them is to fall in love. He also says art is a good way, political activity, friendship. There are lots of ways to make meaning in life, says Camus. Love is one of them, but not the only one. Now that's a little different from the Christian story, which if you understand your Christian theology, love is a central component to the whole thing, right? The existentialists, in a say, you could say they open up the borders a little bit. Okay, so we've gone through several ways of approaching all of this. We talked about idealization and love. And then next time, we're going to end up talking more about this, is that what is the ethical component of all this? I'm going to turn to some puzzles here in a second. Any questions about where we've been in terms of this history and methods so far? Yeah. The brain, yes. Well, this would be in the biological stuff. We did a little bit of that last time. It may just be hormones, right? And there may be certain centers in the brain that are fueled and facilitated by oxytocin. We talked about that brain chemical last time. And pheromones, and there could be just a naturalistic Darwinian story here, right? That these bodies are just mechanisms to transport genes to the next generation, right? Through the process of exchanging bodily fluids with another human being. Brains come along as a way to make that all happen, right? There could be a Darwinian story about sex selection, right? How the mating process actually creates certain extra features of our bodies that allow us to attract mates and so on. Do you want to say more about brains?
Well, there was a recent study about altruism, and it was saying, there's two sections of the amygdala, and the one side was larger in altruists, and the other side was larger with psychopaths.
Yeah.
And that they were on the same continuum, which I found fascinating.
Yeah. No, and clearly we are our brains. Brain matters in all of this. It sounded like a pun. I wasn't sure of that. But brains matter in all of this, right? Here's my view of the brain. There is a lot in philosophy land. There's a lot of reductionism to brains. People are obsessed now with talking about brains. That's okay. Brains are interesting. We all have them. But what do they mean? From the humanities standpoint that I come from, the neuroscience can tell us a lot of interesting data, but we, as brains, still have to make sense of our brains. So when we use words like love or altruism or psychopathology, are those good or bad? Now we have to do a little ethics. Are psychopaths enjoyable or not? A little aesthetics, right? I think it can't only be brain. Although some of my colleagues think it may only be brain. And now is a real puzzle. Try to think as a brain. Not as a person, to use not as a human being, but to think as a brain. Can you feel your amygdala right now doing its thing? We encounter the world not as brains, but as cultured beings, right? Our literature and our history and our philosophy and our religion and our experiences color our experience of the world. And when we use language, our language isn't referring to brains, it's referring to something else. The language may be totally wrong, by the way, when we use the word love. we're thinking about the presence of it could just be brains, you know. I don't know, any thoughts about brains? Yeah.
Well, this doesn't have anything to do with philosophy, but it has to do with biology. We now know that 1/4 of all of our calorie use goes to our brain. I don't know what it's doing with it.
It's important that we have brains, right? Yeah. I love this one bit of a story about, brains and longevity and so on, is that, our brains are waiting to learn things through the whole life. And we need multi-generational inputs into those brains, right? Because we certainly wouldn't want the young adolescent lovers training the future generation because they're so stupid and deluded by hormones that they're not going to teach the right thing, Maybe the brain improves itself over time, and so when you think about structures of caregiving and so on, and the importance of elders in the community and grandparents and so on, right? That actually is helpful. And we're one of the few species that has this intergenerational caregiving process. I've heard this, it could go either way. Maybe that's one of the reasons our brains are so powerful and big, is we get this long-term feedback over time, right? Or vice versa, could work the other way around. Yeah.
In your classes, I've heard you as a philosopher use the term what is right a lot. And I mean, even that, when you're looking at the brain, somebody who might be right brain dominance might think something from the heart might be right. Left brain might need it to add up in columns to be right.
Right.
So doesn't that determine a lot of?
Yes, so. How do we answer these questions about what's right and what's wrong, what's just and unjust, what's good and what's bad, what's beautiful and not beautiful, right? These are the philosopher's questions. One answer may be we just consult our brains. So the left brain people will say this, the right brain people will say that. The psychopaths will say one thing, the altruists will say another thing. Those answers come out of our brain structure or something. But here's the problem, is the answers provide feedback into the brain, right? So brains are plastic and malleable. So, I mean, apart from like real psychopaths who can't be cured because it's a brain malfunction, actually we put inputs into the brain through education, through philosophy and literature and art and all the rest of it, through the way language works, which means that somehow we got to figure out which kind of inputs we want to put in order to adjust this plastic organ, right? Which means, oops, now we got to go back and answer that question again. What are the right inputs? The left brain person may say one thing, the right brain person may say another thing, and then so it goes. I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? How do we decide which answer is the right answer? But clearly we need to make that decision. And every day we're making some decision about what we're putting back into our brains, about what we listen to, about what we watch, about what we consume. How do we make those decisions? It seems to me it's more than just brain. It's culture, it's literature, it's religion, and all the rest of this stuff. Because we don't find ourselves as brains alone on a desert island. Instead, we're brains in bodies in worlds that have histories. I may not persuade you on my cultural standpoint, but yeah.
Well, how about if you look at it, we all have our own individual computer. We are already computerized.
Yeah.
As you say, the brain controls a lot of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the cognitive psychologists that I know, I haven't studied this, but they talk about modules in the brain, right? There are sort of like chunks and pieces that are ready to go with language and understanding music and processing visual input and so on. The modules are there waiting to be programmed in a sense, right? So like there's this idea about sort of an implicit grammar somehow in the brain. The brain is ready to learn language. It's waiting though for a particular language. Is it going to be Russian? Is it going to be Chinese? Right? And that's a factor of the brain's arriving into a cultural world, right? Where now Chinese is put in or Russian is put in. There's a lot of interesting issues there. And back to love. You could argue the brain arrives ready to love or ready to learn about love or be programmed with regard to love, right? Now the philosopher's question is, which program are we going to put into that little brain? You know, is it the male-dominant Dr. Freud version? Is it egoism? Is it a Christian version about altruism and the mystery of love in the universe? Is it something different? We make those choices as cultures. Yeah.
All of that could come from having the right kind of parents. That is, if we know now from research in clinical psychology that early traumas, early difficulties between parents and babies result in character defects in the adult. And on the other hand, if we have parents from birth who are kind and supportive to us and are always something positive, but at the same time they also discipline us, expect us to act certain ways and not other ways, those people grow up to be loving and giving people.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like that's at the source of the whole thing.
Yeah, the developmental model matters, right? I mean, we can still talk about brains with this. Brains encounter worlds and encounter mothers and human beings, and they either get what they're looking for or they don't, and then they have to adjust and adapt, and if they're not satisfied in one way, they're going to come up with a coping mechanism and adjust, and maybe certain parts of the brain don't develop properly because they're not receiving the kind of inputs that the brain is waiting for. You clearly have to get your brain science understood there. But let me go back just briefly to this I love, therefore I am thing, because it connects to what you're saying. The existentialists are saying that just without brain. Right? I mean, especially this kind of existentialism. That we arrive on the scene and it's love that leads us forward out of ourselves towards other people, out of our narcissistic, egoistic, Freud dark corner towards something more genuine and more human. So Fromm was saying this Monnier is saying something similar. Brain can explain, he can explain it in terms of brain science, but you can set the brain aside and just talk about the experience, which is what, in this 20th century, it's existentialism. It's also called phenomenology, which is just a big word for describing the experience of things. You can look at the brain science of it, but you can also look at it from the experiential standpoint. I know you had your hand up. Let me move on to some of these puzzles here, because they're not easy. This is 10. I came up with 10. There's probably more, and maybe you could condense them to a couple. How do we define love? Can we will love? Can we make mistakes with regard to love? The egoism problem we've already talked about. Can free people really love? That's an interesting question. How does this relate to possessiveness? The singularity of the beloved object. Can there only be one object of love, or can there be many? Reciprocity, sex, and then ethics. Now we're going to end up with this one next time. So next time we'll spend most of the time talking about how love is fleshed out in terms of ethics. Let me go through a couple of these, and we're not going to do justice to any of these, but if I were teaching the class to undergraduates, we'd probably spend a day on each one of these problems, and we'll go through it in about 15 minutes. We already talked a bit about this, but it may be that our language, the language we use to talk about love, is just bad. Right? When we use the word love so promiscuously, pun intended, we end up saying stuff that doesn't mean anything. Right? Because when we use the word love to talk about this romantic connection, can that at all be the same thing as God's love? And can that be the same thing as sibling love and familial love and love of country and all the rest of that? It might be that the word love is a useless word.
It might just be
It's
our
ambiguous.
English language, because in Greek language there are several different words for love that have all of those.
Yes.
They're more defined.
So we talked about the philia, eros, agape. There's a couple others you could even throw in there. That tells you something about us. Maybe our language is so lame that we can't think as deeply as the Greeks. Maybe. Or another possibility, maybe there's something really essential about that ambiguity. You know, maybe love is this thing that unites all of these things, like patriotism to love of your child and so on. A lot of puzzles there. We'll move on. Can the will choose to love? Can you decide to love? Or is love something that happens to you against your will? When we have the language of falling in love, this may be just a turn of phrase in English. Do the French say something like tomber en amour? Something? No, they don't say that? It may be that love is something that happens to us that we don't have any control over. So the biological side of things, it may just be how she smells. Ah, love. You know? It may be that bodies do their thing and there is no choice in the matter. Or it may be that we can actually control our bodies and teach them to love things. I don't know what you think about that. What about these kind of problems? We love things, but we know we shouldn't. And we use the word here too, right? I love my heroin. You know, I love that alcohol. Like, you know, the addict's love of the thing that satisfies his desires. What do we do about that? Can we will ourselves not to love something that we know is bad for us? You think so? You can just choose not to love it anymore. Maybe. I mean, maybe it's a process and a practice and it takes a lot of effort. Yeah.
Could it be possibly just our human need to survive? Procreation falls in under that, but just our need for survival is a pretty fundamental
Yeah.
field.
Meaning that self-love kicks in? Is that what you mean?
Sure.
Or?
I'm not sure. I don't think that's what I had in mind. I think it was just surviving.
Yeah.
A child would need a mother to nurse.
Right.
As we get old, we need parents to take care of us. It's
Right.
basic.
Well, it may be. I mean, I maybe hear where you're going with this. Love has nothing to do with the will. It's human urges, right? You can't help it. You just love your mother. Is that right? Or you can't help it. Mothers just love their children. Not always true, though, right? So, I mean, you could hear how this could become. Now, what if there was the mother who just didn't hit it off? Didn't smell right. But wouldn't we say about that mother that she should try to love the child that she doesn't feel loving towards?
Seems like the word need comes in here somewhere. That what you think maybe love is really just a physiological need or an emotional need at that time.
Yes. So, okay. Now, is love just a bit of need satisfaction, or is it a giving? Right? We're trying to receive something, or do we actually have an obligation to give something away?
Well, I think that's the illusion is it love or is it need? Am I with this person out of love, real authentic love, or need?
Love, authentic love meaning for their benefit, concern for their well-being.
Right.
Yeah. Can you force yourself to be concerned with the well-being of someone else? No? You think so? Yeah.
I think you can pretend.
You can, you think you can force yourself to love someone else, and you think you can fake it.
Maybe fake it enough. Yeah, do it.
Fake it till you make it.
Until the heart opens and it becomes authentic.
Yes. Now it might be, I like this. So it might be, one solution here is to talk about love as a practice. Right? You need to try it. And more than once. And consistently, and maybe with some coaching and some feedback and some support from the community and so on, right? If you think about any kind of religious practice or any other kind of practice like a clarinet, right? You don't just wake up one day knowing how to play the clarinet, right? Instead, you need ongoing practice and research and support and coaching. Maybe love is like that. Maybe if there is to be love that is willed and controlled, it needs to be part of that kind of nurturing environment and an ongoing practice. What about mistaken love? This is an interesting problem. Sartre actually is very interested in this one. Sartre thinks often we're mistaken about love. You hear that master-slave dialectic again? We've completely dominated the other person. Ah, she loves me now. Bull, right? We know that there's a lot of misunderstanding that happens in love. It might be that the solution to this one is to follow Socrates and Plato. You have to go through the philosopher's route and have knowledge first, right? You have to understand the truth about human being, about human relationships. Then maybe you won't be mistaken. Do you think you could be mistaken about love? Because they can lie to you. On the other hand, I think maybe I mentioned this last time, could be like a toothache. You just feel it. Could you be mistaken about a toothache? Maybe you can't be mistaken about love either. We talked a bit about this one. Here's a connected issue. Can you love another person without also loving yourself? No. So you got to get the ego part worked out first. Why?
Because you have to know it. You must have value in yourself to be able to love someone else.
You have to have the understanding of what love is. You have to feel value in order to respect value and see it in someone else.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're right on. I agree with you on this. Trick, is it easy to love yourself?
No.
That's the hardest thing to do. You know, you look at your driver, you're looking around, oh crap, not me again, you know? I mean, all of these problems of self-loathing and disappointment and regret and remorse, maybe that makes love impossible. I mean, we can't love ourselves. Is there any hope for loving other people? One possible alternative, some of these existentialists seem to point in this direction, that you can learn to love yourself better by being loved by someone else. Right? This is master-slave again, right? So maybe when the other person actually gives you what you want, suddenly you feel worthy of the thing that you have wanted all along. Or, of course, you just feel guilty and shame. And so, you know. Yeah.
I've been sitting here listening because I've thought for several years now. It's fascinating to me that I now value loving others more than I value them loving me. And I guess that's maturity. When you're young, you want them to love you so much. But as I've gotten older, if I had to give up one or the other, I would give up them loving me. I would be happier that I could love others.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. But I think that's, does anybody else feel that way? I mean, I think it's better to love than to be loved. It really is, and I didn't feel that way at 20.
Yeah, yeah. And you're not even interested in the fact that when you are being loving, it responds, it bounces back. No. You don't want the bounce back.
It's just, it gives the endorphins or whatever it does in your brain to just love.
Yeah.
That's the good part.
Yeah. I think some of this happens when you have children too. I don't know if that's your experience, but I find, or dogs. That's master-slave relationship with the dog. What I found with my own children is that when I see them happy, you know, I just want them to go be happy. You know, even if they don't come home later, I'm like, I'm glad you had a wonderful day because that's good for you, you know.
And they're part of you.
They're part of you, yeah. So it's egoistic. Darn it. Dr. Freud, we can't escape. Let me skip through a couple of these. Let me go to this one because I'd like to get to the ethics problem just to lay it out for you. And then I want to conclude in 5 minutes and hear whatever else you have to say. I mean, the children problem comes in here. Just think about that. I really think it's possible to love. Is that me? Okay. I think it's possible to love lots of people in lots of ways. Now, I'm not saying that we should have plural marriage or anything like that, but there's an interesting puzzle with regard to that, right? How much of a capacity does any one person have to love anyone? Infinite capacity. Thank you. Wouldn't that be amazing if we just had an infinite amount of love and could give it promiscuously to everyone? Yeah.
Do you know what the more modern term is for polygamy nowadays?
Tell me.
Polyamory.
Polyamory,
This is
yes.
what my daughter's generation, they're talking about this whole concept of, have you heard that term?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, that opens up what you're talking
Yeah.
about. There's many ways to love and be loved, express love, and many configurations in which to do that other than just the traditional.
But
Yeah.
you choose the Christian
Absolutely, no, it's
perspective, then-
absolutely choice. It's absolute choice. It has to be mutually acceptable.
Now, this is, I worry about this because, I know the young people,
Yeah.
They're doing stuff.
Just like we in the 60s did. They're-
Yeah, well, but we may have learned better. I mean, it may be.
We had guilt when we did it.
Beyond guilt, guilt is a Freud problem too, back to the problem. We skipped that one. But the problem of possessiveness and the master-slave problem again. Maybe I would like to be the master over lots of people, but I only want them to be my slave. I don't want them to have other masters. Now, if this was going to work, you're talking like cats and dogs sleeping together. All kinds of stuff going on. It would have to be so mature, right? Without any domination, without any possessiveness, so there'd be no jealousy, no envy. I just don't know, given human nature, if that's possible. Yes?
What was that term she said?
Polyamory. Polyamory. Yeah. Yes?
These puzzles, it's having an interesting effect on the way I'm thinking about this course, because now it's all running together.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that this lady just brought up about changing the way you feel about someone. If you think about loving your children, when they're born and until they start talking and walking, of course you love them. But you get into a situation where this child and you may come into conflict with each other, or this child and you may have differences. And where it comes out is you say to your children, yeah, I love you, but now it's tough love. We're not going to put up with this anymore. We're going to build a box here, and you're going to live by our rules. Something to that effect. And the idea that love starts out one way and stays forever, obviously, that's not what life experience is for me.
It changes.
It changes.
And we make the mistakes, back to the mistaken problem, when we don't let it change. Right? Because the people that we are and that they are, we evolve and develop. And the mistake happens when we think they were someone that they previously were, or never were even, right? This is the projection, the illusion problem again. We pretend that these other people are someone that they're not. Notice how that's egoistic and narcissistic, because we want them to be who we want them to be, rather than allowing them to become who they are.
And because you love these people, you still love them. But it's a totally different way of doing it by saying, yeah, but you can't do this, or you can do this, and we've got to help you in this way, or we got to help you in this way. And it's so different as time goes on.
Yeah, and this takes us to the ethics issue, because if this is gonna work, right? How you're describing this, we have to have a paradigm of what's good. Right? We want to say that if we're loving someone, we're actually helping them be their best self. But that's a problem because that best self may be a projection that I'm laying on that person. How do we know what the other person's best self is? Back to this other problem of loving her. How do we know what our own best self is? Now we have to layer in all this stuff, and it's not just brains, unfortunately. It's ethics and culture and tradition and left and right brain and all the rest. How do we figure out what the good is that we're aiming at through all of this, right? Because if we say we love someone, we want what's good for them. So now we need ethical judgments. And we also say that it's supposed to be good for all of us, right? Because we can be obsessed with people that screw up. And maybe sometimes the best thing is to let them go. I mean, it's sad but true. Now we get into all these conversations about ethics. Let me conclude with this brief puzzle, and then I'll give you my Thanksgiving wish. I wrote a paper about this. I have a friend who wrote a book on the philosophy of love, and he has a kind of a Christian view on this, but he pointed me towards this puzzle, which is that if ethics requires us to do something, if there's a duty, right? If ethics involves any kind of duty or obligation, it's very puzzling to say we have a duty to love, because love seems to be something that goes beyond duty. It's something that happens. You know, I just love you. I love my children. I can't help it. If you told me I had to love my children, it would actually get in the way. You know, there seems to be something about love that is either deeper or more transcendent than the ethical duty stuff. So that's where we'll end up next time and try to talk about that. So here's my, I wanted to give you my, my Taoist thought for Thanksgiving. The total non sequitur here. But the Taoists, ancient Chinese philosophers, and I love this passage from the Chuang Tzu, and Chuang Tzu says, "The ancient masters slept without dreaming and woke without concerns. Their food was spare and simple. Emerging without desire, going back without resistance, they received life as a gift and handed it back gratefully." Wouldn't it be nice, Thanksgiving, you know, we just take what we get and then we're thankful for it. If you have any questions or thoughts, we have a few minutes. Yeah.
I found it interesting when you were talking earlier about the father giving the daughter away and the house, the new groom taking her as sort of a possession and sort of equating that to owning a car, and the symbol for owning a car is a pink slip.
The gender things come in all kinds of ways. You're right. It makes me rethink all that 60s hot rod music. Like there was something about the pink racing for pink slips. And yeah. Well, I'll try to bring in some more gender stuff next time. Yeah.
In some of the books that I've read and that sort of thing is that the arranged marriages back in history turned out to be very successful and very living over time. So maybe you can learn to.
Well, this is the very, I mean, in case you didn't hear, she says arranged marriages can work out okay and include love. So it may be that we get married first and then learn to love, right? Which is this commanded to love thing. Like you don't have any choice. You're together. Now learn to love each other. I mean, I understand it can happen. And I've even heard reports from people, right, that this happens. It seems to me we skipped the slide about freedom, but with my Western civilization lens, my American emphasis on liberty, it seems like freedom has to be in there. Freedom has to come first. Master, slave, what do you want from the other? You want their freely given love. You know, you don't want their dad to have signed them over and now they're forced to love you. That doesn't seem to me as deep in terms of freely given love. Yeah.
D.H. Lawrence wrote a novel called Women in Love, and it covers many of the things that have been talked about today in terms of relationships between men and women and men and men. And I highly recommend it to anybody who wants to find out more about this.
That you should propose that for one of those book clubs that you all do. Yeah. Well, thank you. Have a great Thanksgiving.